Financial repression is a tool that has been used by governments for centuries that allows the government to deleverage while forcing individuals in the economy to pay for it. The United States government itself has used financial repression of various kinds for at least 150 years. And given the current state of the union's financial mess, it is becoming increasingly likely that we will face new rounds of financial repression soon. And if you don't prepare for it before it starts, then you will be the one who's footing the bill. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Joe Brown. I'm a former stockbroker turned YouTuber who spent years advising the top 1% on how to manage their wealth. And then after I made enough money to leave that corporate world behind, I've turned my attention now to teaching regular people financial strategies that exist outside the mainstream, things you'd never hear from a typical stockbroker or financial advisor. So first, what is financial repression? Well, very basically, it is a category of tools that allow governments to deleverage without having to go through austerity, raising taxes, decreasing spending. For most of human history, if you had a government, let's say a king, who was running out of gold, they would have to stop spending the money at some point. They just don't have any. The only way they could get more would be to hire soldiers to go to their citizens and extract gold violently from them. In which case, usually the society would just collapse, there would be a revolution, they'd put a new person in charge. But in the age of central banking and fiat, there is a third option. It's got the same end net result, where by force wealth is extracted from citizens, but it's just done so sneakily and so under the table that most people never realize it's happening. But when people do realize it's happening and they try and protect their wealth, financial repression comes in to make sure people cannot. Usually governments need to enact some sort of financial repression when they are facing a debt doom loop or a sovereign debt crisis, meaning they are staring down the barrel of defaulting on their debt if things keep on going the way that they're going. They have borrowed so much that the interest rate lenders are demanding for them to borrow more just to pay back their old debt is more than they can afford. For most nations, the level at which that occurs is somewhere around 90% debt to GDP. But for developed nations that have much larger, more globally connected economies, many economists say the level is around 120%. You can see by this chart, the United States has been here before due to the spending and borrowing from World War II, and the United States was able to deleverage after that. However, we are back up to the same levels today. And one thing you'll notice as we move through this video is that one of the main ways the United States government was able to deleverage and back away from that cliff when they hit 120% was because of financial repression. Essentially, without financial repression at this point, once you hit 120%, every dollar the government borrows gets spent into the economy, but doesn't increase GDP by at least $1. And so as government leverages up its debt to GDP, you start to see diminishing returns where every dollar that they borrow and spend goes from increasing GDP by, let's say, $2 down to $1.50, down to $1.20. But once you get to these really high debt to GDP levels, every dollar borrowed and spent has a negative return of increasing GDP by maybe 75 cents, 50 cents, 25 cents or less, which means the cost of paying for the debt grows faster than their ability to take more money to pay for that debt. Now, even without getting to 120% debt to GDP levels, governments typically will use financial repression in order to escape nasty financial situations. One example of the United States government doing this is Executive Order 6102. With Executive Order 6102, FDR outlawed the ownership of gold by American citizens, forcing all American citizens to turn over their gold to the United States government. Now, at the time, there was no change to the wealth that American citizens had at that point because they got paper dollars in return for the gold. However, as soon as all the gold was turned over to the government declared that the value of gold in dollar terms had changed, which allowed the government to then print more dollars because suddenly they had a higher value of gold in storage. This massive increase in the dollar supply led to inflation that the government was able to use in order to help its financial predicament. And the individuals who used and held dollars were the ones who bore the expense. And that is far from the only example. If we take a look at this paper from richmondfed.org, the Federal Reserve documents examples of financial repression being used in the United States, going all the way back to the Civil War, when they used the National Bank Act to require banks to hold U.S. government securities. In other words, forcing banks to loan money to the government in order to maintain being a legal bank. At the time, the United States government was borrowing that money at a lower rate than the inflation rate. And as you'll see, this is going to be a very common theme, a very common used tool for financial repression, negative real rates. The Federal Reserve goes on to document examples of financial repression that existed in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. The main tool, though it's not the only tool, used for this is negative real rates. Let's look at a chart to see what I mean. This is a chart of real interest rates going back to 1870. The black line represents the nominal interest rate of the United States 1-year Treasury. In other words, when the government borrows debt and pays it back 1 year later, this black line represents the interest rate in nominal terms that they are paying. The red line on the chart represents the inflation rate. In other words, the rate at which prices are increasing every single year. And then finally, this blue line represents what the real interest rate is after you adjust the nominal rate for the inflation rate. If that doesn't make sense to you, imagine I borrow $100 from you and I owe it back to you 1 year from now, and I'm gonna give you 5% interest on that loan. That means 1 year from now, I'm gonna give you back $105. However, if during that 1 year period of time, the things that used to cost $100 now cost $110, you had a negative real return of 5%. While you did get the positive nominal return of 5%, meaning you got $5 more than you had before, your real purchasing power went down because you can't buy the same stuff you could with that $105 that you used to be able to buy with the $100. Now you need $110 to buy the same amount of stuff. So your real purchasing power went down. And by the way, if you're looking for somebody to walk you through exactly what comes next for America, and more importantly, what you can do about it, you need to subscribe to my brand new newsletter, Letters from a Heretic. It's the only place where I'm going to go deeper into some of these topics that I seriously doubt you're gonna hear about from anyone else. As soon as you sign up, you're gonna start receiving my 5-day series called The Most Dangerous Ideas in America. These are ideas so powerful they could reshape the economic landscape of our nation. We talk about things like the real reason we could be on the verge of World War III, the rise of the House of Saud, the true location of the financial all-seeing eye, a secret manuscript that predicted the end of America and what it means for your wealth. We talk about America's coming dark summer and even the final phase of the US dollar. So if you're interested in receiving that so you can make better decisions about how to grow and protect your wealth, especially during times of crisis, click the link below, enter your email, and I'll start showing you everything I know. When real interest rates are negative, in other words, when the blue line is below the 0 line, a negative percent, it means interest rates after adjusting for inflation are negative. When real interest rates are positive, in other words, if prices aren't changing and I pay you back 5%, you benefit, the lender, because when all is said and done, you have more wealth at the end of the story than I do. But the opposite is true as well. If real interest rates are negative, meaning after you adjust for inflation, you got a return of lower purchasing power than you had before, the borrower is the one who comes out on top. Debt will always represent a real transfer of wealth either from the lender to the borrower or from the borrower to the lender. And all you have to do to know which way that wealth is being transferred is look at the real interest rate. And anytime the real interest rate is negative, borrowers are receiving a transfer of wealth from lenders. And in this case, the borrower that we are looking at is the United States government, because we are looking at the chart of what the government pays to borrow money versus the inflation rate. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, if interest rates are truly negative on a real basis after adjusting for inflation, who would be a lender? And that is exactly the question that people ask themselves when confronted with this choice. And in most cases, people who have their head on straight will say, no, I don't want to lose money, so I'm not going to lend at a rate lower than the rate of inflation. And that's when financial repression sets in, so the government can force this to happen. Going back to this Federal Reserve paper, when under the National Bank Act, banks were required to lend the US government money in order to maintain being a bank, or when the Federal Reserve engaged in yield curve control in order to keep government borrowing costs at almost 0. You can see during this time how deeply negative real yields became. Again, all done by force. And this is not something that is stuck in the past. We can see that for the past 2.5 decades, for most of the time, real yields have been negative. Now, recently they they have moved positive again, which is one of the reasons why the US government is in such a sticky financial situation. The transfer of wealth is going back from the borrower to the lender, and they will reverse that transfer when push comes to shove. One of the ways that they can do this is by some simple changes to our current banking system that they've already trialed in the recent past. Currently, banks are limited in how many US treasuries they can buy. In other words, there is a regulatory limit on how much money the banks can lend to the US government. It is already being talked about that that limit would be eliminated, which means that banks could lend as much money as possible to the US government with no limits and no repercussions. And if the value of those bonds fell temporarily, like happened at the beginning of 2023, the Federal Reserve already has tools in place to allow banks to offload those bonds to the Federal Reserve at full price, even if that's not the real value of those bonds. Meaning banks, with a few changes to the rules of the banking system, could become an unlimited money printer lender to the United States government with no repercussions. This tool alone could allow the government to deleverage and transfer enough wealth to themselves in order to inflate away the cost of their debt. But if people catch on that it's happening, then that tool alone might not be sufficient. This paper from the IMF in 2015 lays out a plan for governments to be able to liquidate their debt in a situation just like the US faces today. And they warn governments that they are likely to need to use financial repression, which is a tax on bondholders and savers, to be able to enforce negative or below real market interest rates. Things like capital controls and regulatory restrictions might be necessary in order to do this. And the IMF didn't just stop there. In 2023, they published this paper about capital controls during times of crisis. And their key finding was that countries that had pervasive capital controls in place before the crisis actually started were shielded, while countries with more open capital accounts saw a significant decline in capital flows during the crisis. In other words, the IMF is warning governments, if you are looking down the barrel of a debt death spiral, a sovereign debt crisis, where the cost of paying for your debt is growing faster than your ability to get new money to pay for that debt, you are going to have to use financial repression, mainly negative real yields. However, if you do not lock down the ability for people to take their wealth out of the system prior to imposing negative real rates, then you will have capital flight and you will not be as effective as being able to draw wealth out of the economy in order to deleverage yourself. And so if you want to be able to use financial repression effectively, you're going to have to put capital controls in place before the crisis actually begins. Which means if you want to protect yourself from being the sucker that's going to be forced to pay for the government to liquidate its debt onto you, you need to get prepared before those capital controls are started. So here are a couple of very practical things that anybody can do in order to protect your wealth from financial repression, whether you're starting off with a little or you need to scale this up to protecting multiple millions. Number one, purchase physical gold that is held in private vaults in different countries. The reason for this is because physical gold held in private vaults in other countries is not reportable to the US government. Now, if you sell the gold for a gain, you are still obligated to pay capital gains tax on that. This is not a tax evasion strategy. This is a reporting avoidance strategy, which means you are now able to get some wealth outside the system that the government will not know about. And a nice bonus on that is that if you ever do need to flee someday for any reason, there's wealth waiting for you somewhere else. Number two, beware of doing this with cash. If you do this with cash, it is reportable. You have a bank account somewhere overseas, you have physical cash in a safety deposit box or a vault in another country, that is reportable. You do not want to do this. Number three, purchase Bitcoin and keep it in cold storage. Bitcoin is the only cryptocurrency that the US government has realized they cannot shut down. Many politicians are now realizing that and trying to position themselves on the pro-Bitcoin side of things instead of the anti-Bitcoin side of things. All of the other cryptocurrencies have large enough surface areas of attack where governments control it or they can shut it down if they want to. Bitcoin is the one exception to that. However, the government can control the on-ramps and the off-ramps for Bitcoin. This is why you see the recent push from inside the political establishment to authorize things like Bitcoin ETFs. Because if they can't stop people from owning it, they want to be able to control where the money comes in from and where the money goes out to. Again, because capital controls need to be in place before financial repression. And so if you don't already own Bitcoin outside of the traditional financial system before those controls are in place, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for most people to do so afterwards. And then finally, keep one foot inside the system. Moves like this always present massive opportunities to profit because there are big misallocations of resources, big overvaluations in certain sectors and industries, big undervaluations in others, and taking advantage of these price and value swings represents massive opportunities for profiting. And if you try and go completely off grid and live completely outside the system, that is a big red flag. And if you make a big enough impact, they might come after you anyway, even if you haven't technically broken any laws. And if you want me to help you apply ideas like this to your investing so that you can grow your wealth faster and protect your wealth, especially during times of crisis, that's what I've created Heresy Financial University for. Click the link in the description below for more info. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.